The Wyoming winter of 1872 could freeze a man's very soul. The land, covered in layers of snow and ice, seemed as if it had been cast into eternal slumber. For days, the storm had battered the small town, and the wind roared like a wild beast, tearing through the trees and the cracks in the buildings. The air was sharp, so cold that it made the bones ache and the breath catch in the chest. Inside the church, the cold was no less fierce. The people gathered here, drawn by the sounds of the hammering wind outside, their breath fogging the frozen air. They were hungry, worn down by weeks of winter's toll, faces gaunt and bodies weak from months of deprivation. But it was something more than hunger that brought them to this moment. It was desperation, and it was judgment. At the center of this gathering stood Eloise. Barely 20, her body frail and trembling, but there was something fierce in her eyes, a defiance that not even hunger could crush. Her wrists were bound with coarse rope, the hemp digging into her skin, leaving deep, raw marks. Her clothes were tattered and soaked with snow, her blonde hair matted against her face, a tangled mess of dirt and ice. She was cold, too cold, but she stood tall as one could when the weight of the world seemed to hang around your neck. The crime, stealing bread, a loaf, a mere loaf of bread. But in this hard land, bread had become more than a basic necessity. It had become a symbol of survival, of hope, of a life that could be sustained, if only for a little while. But for Eloise, it was her downfall. She had taken the bread from the town's only bakery, the very bread that the townspeople had fought over for weeks. The punishment? Death. The gallows had been set up beneath the rotting wooden cross, an ironic place for an execution. The crowd murmured in the freezing air, their voices cold, their hearts colder. The priest stood nearby, his hands trembling as he held the Bible. His face, framed by the frost of his beard, looked like a man who had long ago stopped believing in redemption. Eloise's crime was not merely theft in their eyes. It was a betrayal of their suffering. They had been starving, barely scraping by, while she, this young woman, a stranger to their suffering, had stolen from them. And so, as the wind howled and the snow fell thick outside, the people had gathered, their anger rising with each gust of wind. There was no mercy here. There was only the bitter edge of justice, the kind that came in the form of a rope around a woman's neck. The mob's rage. The anger in the crowd built steadily like the storm outside. It had started as murmurs, whispers of condemnation, but as the cold, hard faces of the townsfolk turned toward Eloise, it became a chant, a chorus of rage. "Thief! Thief!" they cried, their voices rising to a fever pitch. A man near the front, his thin face streaked with dirt and hunger, threw a loaf of stale bread at Eloise. It hit her cheek, splitting as it did, scattering crumbs across the floor. "She stole from us," he yelled, his voice cracking with frustration. "She eats while we starve." His words echoed through the frozen church, reverberating off the stone walls. The crowd took up his chant, their voices a chorus of judgment. "Hang her! Hang her!" they shouted. Each voice carried its own bitterness, its own pain. They weren't just condemning Eloise for what she had done. They were condemning her for everything they had lost. A woman, her face twisted with grief and rage, stepped forward from the crowd. "My mother starved last week," she screamed. "She died with nothing in her belly but snow. And this girl takes what wasn't hers. Let her swing for it." Her voice was filled with sorrow, but more than that, it was filled with the kind of rage that only hunger and desperation could create. The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces set in stone. This was not just about one stolen loaf of bread. This was about everything they had lost. Their homes, their families, their lives, and their dignity. And Eloise, for them, had become the symbol of all that suffering. The priest, his voice trembling with the weight of what was happening, stepped forward, His hands shook as he held the Bible close to his chest, but instead of offering a prayer, instead of pleading for mercy, he snapped the book shut with a resounding thud. "I will not bless this girl," he said. "What she stole was not just bread, it was from the mouths of our children." Eloise's heart clenched at the words. She had taken only what she thought was necessary to survive, but to them it was unforgivable. She wanted to speak, to explain, but her voice was stifled before she could say a word. A rag was shoved into her mouth, and she gasped as it cut off her breath. Her tears burned against her cold cheeks, but she held them back. There would be no begging, there would be no pleading, not for her. The rope was placed around her neck. The cold, rough hemp bit into her skin, and she flinched. Her eyes searched the crowd, but there was no pity to be found. There was only cold judgment, and Eloise stood there, waiting for the inevitable, the noose tightening around her throat. The lone rancher arrives. The moment the trap door was about to open, a violent gust of wind slammed the church doors open. Snow swirled in like a ghost, pouring through the cracks and covering the altar, the pews, and the crowd in a blanket of white. The townsfolk froze, their eyes shifting toward the doorway where a figure stood, tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath the brim of his heavy, snow-covered hat. Clay Matthysse stepped into the church, his boots crunching the snow beneath him. His coat, once a dark brown, was now dusted with layers of snow, and his face was weathered, lined with the hardships of life. His eyes, dark and steady, scanned the room. He was a man who had seen loss, who had faced death in ways most people could never imagine. A widowed rancher, alone on the land, his soul hardened by the brutal realities of life. But as he stepped into the church, something inside him stirred, something that said he couldn't stand by while another person was wronged. Clay didn't rush forward, he didn't shout or draw his gun. Instead, he moved with quiet authority. He took off his hat, brushed the snow from it, and placed it gently on the nearest pew as though he were arriving for a simple Sunday service. His presence in that moment seemed to still the room like the calm before a storm. The crowd watched him, unsure what to make of this stranger who had entered their midst. He wasn't one of them. He wasn't bound by their rules, their anger, their suffering. He was something different, something they couldn't quite understand. Clay's gaze locked with Eloise's. His eyes softened, recognizing her for what she was. Not a criminal, not a thief, but a woman, a human being struggling to survive in a cruel world. He didn't see a threat. He saw someone who needed help. "Step aside," he said, his voice low and steady. A young man, trembling with fear, stepped forward to block his path. "You ain't got the right," he stammered, but Clay didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the young man with eyes that seemed to pierce straight through him. The boy hesitated, then backed away. Without a word, Clay climbed the steps to the altar. His hand brushed against the worn, cracked wood of the cross, and for a moment it seemed as if the entire church held its breath. Clay paused. His hand reached out, gentle and steady, and tucked a stray strand of Eloise's hair behind her ear. Her eyes widened in confusion. Then, with the calm certainty of a man who had faced death and survived, Clay drew a knife from his belt and sliced through the rope around Eloise's neck. The noose fell, and she collapsed into his arms, gasping for breath as the crowd watched in stunned silence. Clay whispered, "Eat first," as he gently placed a warm loaf of bread into her trembling hands. The crowd, once so certain of her fate, could only stand and stare, a simple act of mercy. The tension in the room was thick. The crowd stood frozen, their anger and judgment now battling with confusion. They didn't know what to make of Clay. He had just defied them. He had cut the rope that would have ended Eloise's life. He had taken the bread from his coat, placed it into her hands, and spoken the simple words, Eat first. Clay didn't care for their approval. He wasn't looking for praise or recognition. He wasn't doing this for anyone but Eloise. He saw a woman starving, desperate and broken, not someone who deserved to die. Eloise's trembling hands clutched the loaf of bread. She didn't question him. She didn't argue. She had no energy left for anything other than survival. The bread was warm against her skin, and it filled her with something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Clay didn't wait for the crowd to say anything. He didn't need their permission to do what was right. Instead, he lifted Eloise into his arms and carried her out of the church, into the swirling snowstorm. The wind bit at their skin, but Clay didn't flinch. He held her close, the warmth of his coat surrounding her, and promised, softly, "I'll keep you safe." The coyotes howled in the distance, but Clay's resolve was stronger than their hunger. He didn't rush. He didn't worry about what the town would say. The only thing that mattered was getting Eloise to safety, where she could rest, heal, and, most importantly, find something she had been denied for far too long: peace. The ride to safety, Clay's horse moved steadily through the snowstorm, the cold biting at his face, but it didn't touch him. His only concern was the woman in his arms. Eloise's body, limp and trembling, rested against his chest, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. The storm was fierce, the wind howling like a beast in the wilderness, but Clay wasn't afraid. He had fought battles before, ones where survival wasn't guaranteed, where every decision could mean the difference between life and death. He had fought for land, for what was right, and for those he cared about. But this was different. He wasn't fighting to protect a piece of land. He was fighting for Eloise's life. "Hold on," he murmured under his breath, more to reassure himself than her. His mind raced as he pushed his horse forward, the snow swirling around them in thick gusts. They were deep in the wilderness now, far from the town, where the law had failed Eloise and left her to die. But out here in the vast emptiness of Wyoming, there was no law but survival. The air around them was frigid, the kind of cold that seemed to freeze your soul, but Clay refused to let Eloise's suffering go unnoticed. He didn't need to ask her why she had stolen the bread. She didn't need to speak. He could feel the weight of her hunger, the desperation in her frail form. She had done what any mother or person in her position would have done, taken what she needed to survive. As the coyotes' howls echoed in the distance, Clay's grip on the reins tightened. They were drawn to the scent of weakness, and Eloise, though she had the strength to survive, was still too fragile to withstand the dangers of the wilderness. He wouldn't let anything harm her, not on his watch. The cold wind stung his face, but he pressed on. Each step he took, each mile they covered, was a small victory against the storm. Eloise's breath was slow, her body lighter in his arms with every passing moment. But Clay could feel the strength she had left, faint but there, and he refused to let it fade. Not while he was still standing, not while he could still fight for her. The moment of truth. By the time they reached Clay's cabin, the storm had begun to calm, though the wind still howled in the distance. The small timber house stood against the elements, a solitary refuge in the wild landscape. Clay dismounted, carefully lifting Eloise from his arms and carrying her inside. The warmth inside was a stark contrast to the biting cold outside, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Eloise's body trembled as Clay gently set her down on a chair near the hearth. The fire crackled, sending flickers of light dancing across the room. Clay worked quickly, tending to the fire and making sure she was as comfortable as possible. She had barely said a word since he found her, her body too weak to speak. But Clay didn't need her to explain. He could see everything in her eyes: the pain, the suffering, the fear. He went to the stove and began to prepare a meal, not asking questions, not probing. Instead, he focused on providing the one thing she needed most: care. His hands moved with quiet expertise as he stirred the pot, the smell of food filling the room. This wasn't just survival, this was mercy, something that had been absent from Eloise's life for far too long. When the food was ready, he set a bowl before her. Eloise stared at it for a moment, unsure. Her hands, though trembling, reached for the bowl, and for the first time since he found her, Clay saw a flicker of life in her eyes. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was starting to heal. "You're safe here," Clay said softly, his voice steady but filled with a tenderness he rarely allowed himself. "You can stay here as long as you need." Eloise didn't respond immediately, but her eyes softened as she glanced at him. He had given her more than just food. He had given her something more valuable. Dignity. She didn't ask for his help. She didn't beg. But he had seen something in her, a quiet strength, a resilience, and he refused to let her face the world alone. Clay sat across from her, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared understanding, a recognition of the pain they had both endured. The fire crackled in the background, its warmth filling the room as Clay watched Eloise eat. Each bite she took seemed to ease some of the tension in her body. And in that moment, Clay knew he had made the right choice. She wasn't just a woman he had saved from certain death. She was someone who deserved a chance to rebuild her life, and that was something he was willing to help her do. A sinister truth emerges. As the days passed, Eloise's strength began to return, but the shadows of her past lingered in her eyes. Though she had found temporary refuge in Clay's cabin, the storm within her still raged. There was more to her story, more than just a loaf of bread and a death sentence. Clay didn't push her to talk. He knew better than to force someone to relive their pain before they were ready. Instead, he quietly supported her, helping with chores around the cabin, sharing his meals, and listening when she finally began to open up. But as much as Clay wanted to believe that Eloise had left her past behind, the truth had a way of catching up with them. One evening, as the fire burned low, Clay was out in the barn when he heard a faint knock on the door. He stepped inside to find a messenger, a young man who looked nervously over his shoulder. "Clay Matthysse?" the man asked, his voice trembling slightly. Clay nodded, keeping his hand near the rifle on the wall. The man held out a sealed envelope marked with the mayor's seal. "This is for you," he said, before quickly turning and leaving as though he'd been chased by a ghost. Clay opened the letter, his eyes narrowing as he read. It was from Bennett Dalton, the mayor's son. It was a thinly veiled threat, a warning to leave Eloise alone or face the consequences. Bennett was tied to her past, and the letter made it clear that he would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. Clay clenched his fists. He knew what this meant. It wasn't just about protecting Eloise anymore. It was about standing up to the injustices that had plagued this town for too long. Bennett had a hand in her suffering, and Clay wasn't about to let him continue to ruin her life. He looked over at Eloise, who had been quietly watching him from the doorway. Her face was pale, and she looked tired, as though the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders. She had trusted Clay, but the ghosts of her past weren't finished with her yet. Clay knew it was time to take action. The time for silence was over. The showdown. The tension in the air was thick the day Clay went to face Bennett Dalton. He knew that the confrontation wouldn't be easy. The town had already made up its mind about Eloise, and now they would have to face the truth. Clay wasn't just standing up for a woman who had been wronged, he was standing up for what was right, and he wasn't afraid of the consequences. As he rode toward the mayor's house, the snow fell in thick flakes, swirling around him like the storm in his mind. The house stood at the end of the town's main street, a symbol of wealth and power in a place where both were scarce. The mayor's family had ruled this town with an iron fist for years, and Bennett Dalton was no different. Clay didn't knock. He didn't need to. The door opened and there stood Bennett, his arrogant smile fading as he took in the sight of Clay. "You brought her here, didn't you?" Bennett's voice was sharp, filled with contempt. Clay stepped forward, his eyes cold and unwavering. "She's not your property, Bennett. She's a human being, and she deserves justice, not your cruelty." The words hung between them like a threat, and Bennett's expression twisted with rage. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Matthysse," he sneered. "You think you can just waltz in here and change things? You're a fool." Clay didn't flinch. He knew what Bennett was capable of, but Clay also knew that it was time to stop being silent, time to stop letting people like Bennett get away with their lies. "I'm not here for your approval," Clay said quietly. "I'm here to make sure she's safe, and if that means fighting for her, then that's what I'll do." Bennett's face twisted with fury. "You don't get to decide that. You've already cost me enough." The confrontation was inevitable. It wasn't just about Eloise anymore. It was about standing up for justice, for the woman who had been wronged, and for everyone who had been silenced by men like Bennett Dalton. Clay wasn't afraid of what was to come. He had faced worse, and he was ready to do whatever it took to protect the woman who had captured his heart. The final confrontation. The storm raged outside, battering the cabin, but inside, a different kind of tension brewed. Clay could feel it in his bones. The confrontation was inevitable. His jaw clenched as he prepared for the worst. Bennett Dalton had made his threats, and now Clay knew that the time had come to face him head on. Eloise had been through enough. Her pain, her suffering, the judgment she had endured for something she didn't do. It was all too much for one person to carry. But now it wasn't just about her survival anymore. It was about making sure no one else was ever left to suffer in silence again. The injustice had gone on long enough. Clay wasn't one to back down. He had lost too much in his life to let anyone else be trampled under the weight of another person's cruelty. He had seen the town's true face, the ones who held power, who hid behind their wealth and status, and used it to manipulate and control. But Clay had lived through worse storms than this one, and he wasn't about to let Bennett Dalton walk away without facing what he had done. As Clay rode into the town square with Eloise by his side, his eyes never wavered. His heart was steady, calm in the face of a battle he knew was coming. The town had already begun to gather, whispering and murmuring among themselves, as they prepared to witness whatever drama was about to unfold. But this wasn't just about a man standing up for a woman. It was about standing up for what was right. The air was thick with the scent of snow and tension. Clay's boots hit the cobblestone with an unshakable rhythm, each step resonating with determination. The crowd parted as he moved forward, their eyes darting to Eloise, who stood quietly beside him, her shoulders tense but her chin high. She had already endured so much, but Clay could see something in her eyes now, something stronger than fear, stronger than pain. She wasn't the woman she had been when they first met. She had found something in this brutal wilderness, something that no one could take away. When they reached the church, the mayor's house looming nearby like a fortress, Bennett Dalton was already there, waiting. His face twisted in disgust when he saw Clay, but he said nothing, his hand resting casually on the polished wood of his cane. "You brought her here," Bennett spat. "You think I'll just let you ruin everything? She's nothing but a criminal." Clay's gaze never faltered as he met Bennett's cold eyes. He knew this was the moment. This was the battle for Eloise's future, and he wasn't going to let her become another casualty of a corrupt system. "She's not a criminal," Clay's voice rang out, low but firm. "She's a woman who was wronged, and I'm here to make sure she's given the justice she deserves." Bennett's lip curled in a sneer, but Clay wasn't afraid. He stepped forward, planting himself squarely in front of Eloise, shielding her from the storm of lies that Bennett would throw at them. "You can't take her," Clay said. "Not anymore." The crowd held its breath as the two men stood face to face, each one unwilling to back down. In the stillness of the moment, it was clear. This wasn't just a fight for Eloise's innocence. This was a fight for everything the town had tried to bury: the truth, the lies, and the brutal injustices that had been overlooked for far too long. Eloise's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood firm beside Clay. She had been abandoned, betrayed, but now she was standing tall, and for the first time, she felt like she had someone who would fight for her. A new beginning. When the last echoes of the confrontation faded and the cold wind of the Wyoming winter settled once more, Clay and Eloise were left standing in the quiet aftermath. The truth had been laid bare, and the town could no longer pretend that their sins were not their own. Bennett Dalton's reign of cruelty had crumbled, and with it, the weight of Eloise's past was lifted. Clay didn't speak for a long time. He simply stood beside Eloise, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. It had taken everything to get to this point, but he knew that the hardest part wasn't over. Now they had to rebuild. They had to find a way to move forward from the wreckage left behind. "Is it over now?" Eloise asked softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. She had seen so much injustice, so much cruelty. She wasn't sure if she could trust that the storm had truly passed. Clay turned to her, his eyes steady and filled with the same quiet strength that had guided him through the years. "For them, maybe, but for us, it's just the beginning," he said, his voice low and resolute. The weight of his words hung between them, and Eloise's heart clenched in her chest. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was drowning in her past. With Clay by her side, she could finally begin to imagine a future where love wasn't tainted by betrayal, where trust didn't come with a price. As they walked back to Clay's cabin, the sound of their footsteps crunching in the snow was the only noise that filled the air. The world around them was changing, thawing, much like their hearts. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, Eloise found herself growing stronger. The warmth of the cabin, the safety of Clay's presence, began to fill the spaces that had been hollowed out by hunger and hardship. And slowly, they started to build something new, something that couldn't be taken away by judgment or fear. By the time the first signs of spring began to show, the harsh Wyoming winter had retreated, leaving behind a landscape of possibility. Green shoots peeked out from beneath the snow, and for the first time in a long while, Clay and Eloise allowed themselves to believe in a future that wasn't defined by their past. Clay stood beside her, his eyes soft yet determined as he spoke. "You've been through more than anyone should have to endure, but you're not alone anymore. I promise you that." Eloise looked at him, her heart swelling with a quiet hope she hadn't felt in years. "I don't want to be alone anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. And in that moment, with the first warmth of spring on the horizon, Clay and Eloise stepped forward together, ready to face whatever came next. The past was behind them, and the future, though uncertain, was something they would face side by side.